Welcome everyone. Welcome to our career workshop series here at the Test Camp. This session is about an hour and it's titled Testing in the USA. You folks joining us live online, you're welcome to contribute your comments anytime. We're going to put as many as we can during the discussion periods right up here in the front. And if you're joining us directly through the Test Camp YouTube channel or through Facebook online there, of course you can pause or restart or replay your video anytime. Okay, it looks like we're all settled in here, so let's go ahead and get started. Now note that this workshop is designed to focus on why testing has become such a major issue in this country, what challenges this poses for stakeholders like parents, teachers, students, educational leaders, and how some of those stakeholders are meeting the challenges. Let's get started with the why. Why is there so much testing? There wasn't this when I was going to school, so here's one way to think about it. You have $300 to spend on a product or service. Okay, so what can you get today for about $300? A television set. Okay, you can paint your house. Maybe you can get a set of car tires. All right, these are all good examples you've seen on commercial advertisements. They're trying to convince you that their products are tested for quality, right? So how much of the $300, say for our car tires, would you expect they spent on testing the quality of the product? Would you expect that the television was tested? All right, how about that paint? Well, would you be satisfied to learn that they pay just about $1 for testing the product? What do you think about that? You just spent $300 on a television set, or say a set of tires, and you learned that only $1 was spent testing them for quality. Is that okay with you? All right, well, talk this through with your neighbor at your tables. Had you thought about this before? How much would you expect would be spent to test for quality on a $300 product? All right, and would it depend on what you're buying? All right, we'll share your thoughts when we return as a group. Hey, welcome to those of you folks who are joining us live online here. Again, feel free to set your thoughts on in, and we're going to put them right up here on the discussion boards. And if you're watching the pre-recorded video, of course, now's a good time to pause it and think this through. How much do you expect a product to be tested? And let's see if your thoughts match the group when you return. Okay, so we're back as a group. What I heard from most of you is you hadn't really thought about this much before. Is that right? Did I get that right for the folks listening in? All right, and did I hear that now that you've thought more about it, you expect more out of the 300 to be spent on testing for quality? Much more, okay? So the ratio we considered then was 300 to 1. For every $300 spent, $1 was spent on testing the product. Okay. Remember this ratio and consider this number. What's this out loud, somebody? $600 billion. Where does this have to do with education in the United States? That's right. That's about how much is being spent annually just on public schooling, K-12 public schooling in the United States. How did you know that? You had an education class right here at the college. Okay, very good. Thanks. All right, here's the second number. What's this? $2 billion. That's right. Any ideas about how this number is related to education? Correct again. $2 billion is a conservative estimate about how much is invested annually on testing and testing services in public or government schools. So $600 billion is the amount we spend annually to run the government schools, public schools. $2 billion is spent on testing. Let's take a moment to think about and compare those figures. Take out the billions. 600 to 2. $2 spent on testing. Make that even simpler. That looks familiar, doesn't it? Now, what did you just say about this ratio a few minutes ago? So, talk about it with yourselves there. What are you thinking about this ratio now? Who is the buyer? Who's paying the $300? And how would you define the product? What does that mean, the product of education? And we'll share your thoughts when we return here in just a few minutes. Hey, welcome again. For those of you joining us live online, feel free to send in your thoughts. We're going to put them right up here, and we're going to include them in the discussions here today. And if you're watching the recording, great time to pause the recording and see if you can answer some of these questions for yourself about the ratio. Who is the buyer, and what do you consider to be the product of public education? All right, we'll be back in just a moment when you join us. back again. So what were some of your thoughts and ideas about the buyer? Right here, go ahead. About the buyer. I'll repeat it for those listening in. All right, so the buyer is not only the tax-paying public, but everyone involved in education. All you call them stakeholders. All right, well, I'm glad I called on the SMART group. Good. All right, so let's get back to more about that in just a moment. What about the product? Who talked about that? How about over here? So the product is the students. Is it? Well, or is it the students' test scores? Yeah, well, we'll talk about that more in just a moment. And before we go any farther, here's a bit of information you might share with your colleagues. We don't pay $300 per student in the U.S. The average amount is about 4 times that, or $1,200 per student. That's what the government's paying for. The public also kicks in too. But anyway, we're spending about $4 on testing per student per year. All right, so another term you hear around education circles is quality. You've heard about or read about this term, right? So what does it mean then to get a quality education? Is there any agreement on that at all? Talk about yourselves here at the tables here for just a few minutes about public school quality. What would be the reaction of taxpayers if they knew that only $4 of the school's budget was being spent on testing? All right, you're starting to see both sides of this a little bit more. All right, we'll share your thoughts when we return as one big group. Thank you for joining us again live online. Send those thoughts and questions in. That's been very helpful. And if you're listening on the YouTube channel or a recording of this video from somewhere, you can come back after you pause that video and see if some of your answers match the ones we talk about here. We'll be right back. All right, good discussion. So many of you talked about quality. You were talking about the word effectiveness. I already had it up here. What do you mean by effectiveness? What do you expect to get back for the money you spent? All right, and I've heard all of these arguments here. So for a television, right, you get a good picture, a good sound, long lasting, easy to use, okay? How about paint? Again, easy to use, covers well, long lasting, durable. Tires, same kind of arguments, right? Good traction, low road noise, and long lasting. Okay, I also heard that you expect to get your money's worth. That's called value. So the money you spend, that's important, but what you're really interested in, the customer is always more interested in the value. You would pay more, right, if you got more value, right? What would happen if you don't? You go get another company, right, another product. There's competition for business. So would you say that that's a big concern of a company? If they want to stay a company, they need to stay in business. And we know that schools are a business. We understand this, right? It's a $600 billion business. And there's some folks who don't think that we're getting our money's worth. So the question now turns to what? We'll start briefly by discussing what the competitors to public schools are proposing. They don't think they're getting their money's worth. So they're saying this: hey, let's organize schools around a theme, either public or privately. Let's start our own schools, call them private schools. And some even want to have schools in their home. Okay, we've heard about all this. This is not recent. In each of these cases, these competitors are challenging the lawmakers to say, you know what, we're not getting our money's worth down there. We want that public money back. The money that we put in taxes, we want to put that in our own charter schools, our own private schools, and our home schools. All right, well, we could talk about that at a different time. That's a whole nother workshop. But if you are a public school spending public money, what might be one strategy to keep the competitors from luring away the customers? You see where we're going with this? If you're a public company, you want to stay in business, so use test scores. Right? If you create test scores. You publish the test scores. You say, look how good the kids are doing down here at this business, then there'd be less chance they'd run off to another business. All right? So the idea, keep the customer satisfied that they're getting their money's worth. And what do we just call that? Value. That's right. They might be less likely to consider the competitors' offers that way. All right? One way you might see a company gain an advantage is to compare the scores with their competitors. Who knows what that's called when you compare one set of scores to another scores here. They could be called norm reference. Right, so what's normal? What's our scores? What should average 7th graders be doing? And look at our scores, how well they're doing, so we can compare them that way. Students in this school or school district, they're compared, to other institutions. Now, how's that working out? Many of you agree with the public. You don't think that test scores provide either a valuable or a reliable measure of value, so this isn't making a very good argument. Here's a recent article printed in the New York Times, and in this case, we're not going to read the whole thing, but in this case, the author is saying two things. I'll just go ahead and tell you what he's saying here. First, what do you need to learn from standardized test scores? Only two things. Their students' socioeconomic standing and the amount of time that it takes away from teaching. Quite a bold statement, but you can see if you go ahead and read this article sometime. For those of you watching this at home, you can go ahead and pause the video and get this down. Because this is some of the argument that the product of schools is just not test scores. So while much of the public sees the problem with standardized tests, there's others that defend them. So you got the left and the right thing going on here. At least one measure of effectiveness and accountability is test scores. All right, so here's a brief overview of some of the public perspectives on this. From the left, here's an argument. Learning gaps widen when testing becomes the main focus of schools. From the right, test scores, particularly when there are gains, serve as evidence that the school has a quality product, the business, right? On the left, proponents of equity believe that each student has the right to be treated differently according to their needs. From the right comes the argument that equality is being promoted when everyone is treated the same, both in the classroom and on the test. That's where standardized comes from, standardized test. How about what's being taught? From the left, the point they make is that the curriculum and consequently the teaching becomes narrowed because it's driven by the test items. The right is satisfied because they think that the basics are being accomplished. That's the focus of the test. Teachers, administrators, and students over here on the left, even the parents, they're growing weary of the school system that's constantly being driven by testing. And in some cases, students and parents are refusing to participate in the testing game. That's what they call it. Have you heard of the opt-out movement? However, some parents, with no other options, put their children's educations right there in the public company. So over here on the right, they're very interested in learning about those published test scores. They see them as a commodity. Back over on the left, creativity is lessened when the focus is just on the test. That's the cries from the left. They think that the best lessons are experiential, hands-on, interesting. Those take time. Those cannot all be tested. According to the right, efficiency, especially on a limited budget, is what's needed to achieve the goals, the public school goals. Have you heard about getting behind? The imaginary goals that have to be met by a certain time. And they have no problem using test scores for placement purposes like grouping the students according to their ability. We'll talk about that in just a minute. So the idea is the students are supposed to work between the ears rather than over here on the left where it's supposed to be more hands-on. You likely notice that these lists are aligned as columns. So we got the left column over here and you have the right. And we did that on purpose. That's just simply a generalization to point out a pattern here for this workshop here today. Generally the left, more progressive, has concerns when the students of different shapes and sizes are all thought of as pegs forced to reshape or to fit a certain size hole. And generally on the right, more traditional group prefers conformity. They like traditions and standards, and it's more subject-centered than more student-centered. How many of you are familiar with the work of Marva Collins? Anybody heard of this before? Only a couple of you. Mrs. Collins was a teacher on the south side of Chicago who started a private school in her home. And the subtitle of her book is Returning to Excellence in Education. And although most of her students were from an impoverished area of town, nearly all were labeled with learning disabilities, she held every one of them to very, very high standards with no concern about their public school records. None. Didn't even look at them. She encouraged them to take risks, to follow their passion, declaring if you can't make a mistake, you can't make anything. Now, the success of her students led to the national acclaim and an expose on 60 Minutes, and a movie, and an offer by the president at that time, who was Ronald Reagan, to head up the U.S. Department of Education. And she politely declined that. She did not want to have anything to do with the public schools. So if you haven't seen this movie, you can find it now on YouTube. Be the best hour and a half you ever spent. But her approach still appeals to the left because it's humanistic. It starts with the students. The appeal to the right is her insistence on learning first basic fundamentals. Now, do you have teachers like that who held you individually accountable for your work, encouraged you to aim high, fail, then aim again? Is that what's going on in schools? So anyway, do you have a preference, especially as it relates to standardized testing? Do you identify more with the left, the progressive side, or the right, the traditional side? Yes, that's exactly right. Neither is correct. They're just simply your preferences. So discuss this at your tables. Where do you think you fall in there? Think of it as a sliding scale. What's your preference? What's your current perspective of standardized testing? Discuss it with your neighbors. We'll share your thoughts when we come back. All right, for you folks joining us today, again, live online, share your thoughts. We're going to include them right up here in the discussion panels. And if you're joining us on the recording, this might be a good time to pause and go ahead and reflect on your perspective. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back. It sounds like we're learning more about our personal perspectives and our personal bias for testing, aren't we? Would anyone here want to guess about what Mrs. Collins' perspective was about standardized testing? Oh, you've read the book. Oh, you saw the movie 2 times. Okay. So what did she say about this? Go ahead and I'll repeat for the folks listening in. Yes, that's what I remember too. Get on with the learning, especially the fundamentals. Apply your knowledge, use your skills to apply your knowledge to the test. Follow your dreams. Your test will take care of itself, no problem. So how many teachers have Mrs. Collins had where she told them to have courage? She told her teachers that she trained to trust their teaching and their students' ability to learn. She wanted the students to think for themselves. Now, one concern about testing is the validity of the tests and the individual test items. Another concern is reliability. So are you familiar with these terms? Valid tests are intentional. They test what they intend to test. And for that reason, some questions attempt to connect all the students' real-life situations. And maybe that's why we see so many PISA examples in math. Yeah, pizza. Yeah, pieces of pizza. An example of an invalid test question is a math word problem, for example, that contains language that's not familiar to the student. So that's a reading problem before it's even a math problem. So if you don't know about that, take a little bit. That's called validity. A reliable test item is one that's dependable. It produces similar results again and again and again. Remember that $2 billion is spent on testing? Well, a sizable amount goes to constructing test items that have both validity and reliability. That's a professional skill that can be quite expensive. Here's a word you hear quite a bit: standardize. Can a company create a single product that's suitable for every customer? Is that practical or even possible? Can a school system create a single standardized test suitable for every student? Is that practical or even possible? That test would have to meet the school's perspective of what constitutes an effective learner. All right, so you can see how difficult this would be. For those on the left, testing is more acceptable when it's less high stakes, when it's given in small doses. You know what formative is? Ongoing testing. You monitor the progress of both the student and the teacher as you go. Over on the right, summative assessment is conducted at the end, as you might imagine, conducted at the end of a unit or a course. It's considered more high stakes because that's when you make decisions about how to place the students or what certification or diploma they might make. But in either case, you can imagine that the challenge to extract useful information from a standardized test for exceptional student education. Can you imagine how hard this would be? Or for ESOL, or English language learners. Unbelievable. So we'll take a brief look at why testing seems to be more and more prevalent. We've looked at that so far. Let's go ahead and start thinking about this. We've already talked about parts of what some of the problems might be in terms of quality education and how some innovative educators are working to measure success. Let's take a look at that for a moment. Have you ever thought about this? There's a learner and then there's a student. These are common terms that are used every day. So what's your definition of each? Do you think that they're the same? Or is there a significant difference between being a learner and a student? Talk about it, compare your definitions for a couple minutes there at the tables, and we'll come back and compare with the whole group. And by the way, there is a difference. All right, for you folks joining us today live online, share your thoughts. We're going to include them in the discussions. And again, for you folks that are joining us through the video, you got a chance to go ahead and pause that anytime. And we'll be here when you return. Okay, welcome back. We've heard some interesting thoughts on the differences. Here's ours, how we do this at the test camp. We consider that the word learner means acquired knowledge. That's where the roots are from. The word student is from the Latin studer, which means to apply yourself or to put forth effort. So they're two completely different things to us. Although related, they can be thought of quite differently. And they have implications for testing too. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Those of you who have a preference for focus on a learner, you probably think more in terms of aptitude and achievement. These are two different things also. Most of you have heard of the SAT, the standardized test, used in some places to determine college admission. What do you think the A might stand for? Yeah, I often hold up a $20 bill and say the first person who can tell me. Now, it's not a bet, but if you can tell me what the A stands for. All right, so you think it's wrong. It's not aptitude. No, it's not achievement. Okay, one more try, anybody? Oh, assessment. Okay, that's a good guess. Also wrong. But you're the closest because the A really has no meaning today. The first SAT claimed that it was testing aptitude, but it really wasn't. So they had to change it, and then they later changed it to achievement. And then later that was just simply changed. It's just a brand name now. Yeah, so SAT doesn't really have any name. It's just a brand name. All right, so do you have a working definition for both aptitude and achievement? They are two different things. Talk about it at your tables there, and we'll finish up with that SAT history in just a minute. By the way, there is a difference between aptitude, of course, and achievement. Those joining us live online, please share your thoughts. We're going to include them in this discussion about aptitude and achievement. And if you're watching the video, good time to pause and make sure that you understand these two important concepts. Okay, we're back. Let's go ahead and finish up with that little bit of the history of that SAT we talked about. Now, the first SAT, they claimed that it was a test of aptitude. So you would have been correct about 90 years ago. Any idea why that name was changed? Nobody has an idea? Well, aptitude is related to the student's capability, their ease of understanding things, making connections from experiences or abstract ideas. So many students like you might claim that you have a higher aptitude for reading or a higher aptitude for math. If you think about it, our language of communication and the language of computation, right? Both are simply a set of symbols with certain meanings, but most of you say that you have an aptitude or a leaning or a preference for one side or the other. Is that right? So when the SAT was called the aptitude test, it was also administered quickly, over 300 questions. I think they had 90 minutes. It really favored certain students, and many would say unfairly. So later the test evolved, and it was changed to be called achievement. That means the stage of accomplishment, where you are, what knowledge and skills have been gained at this point. Can anybody guess why this term was eventually changed? I'll give you a hint. Underserved students, particularly non-Caucasians, scored lower as a group from year to year? Yes, go ahead over here. Test bias, you say. Yes, groups became empowered to stand up to the system, claiming they either had less aptitude and capability. Well, who wants you to say that? Or less achievement, so they learned at the same levels as their Caucasian classmates. So, as mentioned earlier, the A at this point became assessment, which is redundant, assessment test, and meaningless. So eventually this just became a brand name. All right, let's discuss another concept related to testing. Consider the term student. For many of this concept's a bit easier to grasp. Remember, studer. So it has to do with your attitude and your abilities, sometimes called skills or study skills. That's very different from aptitude, isn't it? See how the top two are different from the bottom. So there's a considerable discussion in teacher education about how we might increase a teacher candidate's aptitude up there at the top. You see that? Can you do that? Can you really increase somebody's capability? What if a teaching just doesn't come naturally? Okay. And on the next one here, let's talk about with itness. So can you increase the aptitude or the capability or with itness of somebody, maybe during an internship? How about their achievement? That suggests a certain body of knowledge that everybody would know. Of course, that can be increased. And it can be tested if the test is valid and reliable. That's right. Most tests in school today, particularly standardized tests, are concerned with achievement. How the achievement was acquired by the student is of no concern to the test builders or the test itself. The only concern is that the test taker can reproduce the body of knowledge. All right, so that's a brief look at the learner. What about the students? How are they related? There you go, attitude. This is the student's outlook, their willingness to put forth effort. Our attitude is based on our values, our philosophy, and sometimes referred to as disposition. A can-do disposition is called confidence. A test can be thought of as a performance, so in any performance you can imagine that confidence plays an important role in success. Now, a common fallacy is that some are smart and others have to work at it. As the thinking goes, if I have to work at it, I must not be very smart. Okay, so that doesn't seem to make much sense, but that's what a lot of the kids think. Did anybody here fall into that trap? Sure. In grade school, I was president of the do I can least to do, right, to get by. Yeah, I was president of that club. All right, so let's talk about this for a few minutes. Are you encountering students who think that it's hard work sometimes mean that you have low aptitude because the smart kids don't need to try as much? See what we're talking about here? All right, talk about your tables and we'll come back in just a few moments. All right, for you folks joining us today live online, we're going to share your thoughts up here again today. And if you're watching us through the video recording, good time to pause and join us. We'll be here when you come back. All right, so I agree. It goes back to the learner issue of capability. Again, the thinking is that if I have to work, I must not be very smart. Isn't it the case that many students study in private? Have you heard about this? They don't want to make it look like they actually have to try. This demonstrates misuse of the word smart. The person who is smart is able to take stock of a situation and make a good decision. In the case of testing, they learn about the test. They study and practice the test. And that's a perfect segue in a brief discussion about abilities down here. Again, not to be confused with capabilities. This refers to learned skills. Anybody here taken a student success class or a study skills class? Good, good. What are some skills? Reading for comprehension, right. Listening. What else? Note-taking, organization. The one most important by graduate college seniors, they say it's time management, right? These are all skills. So which of these four traits, if you had to choose only one then, would you say is the most important for success on a test? Not school success, testing success. Is it a learner trait like capability or what we call aptitude? a preference for a certain subject? Or is the other learning trait achievement, what you already know, what you come to school knowing more maybe less? Or is there a great advantage of being a student? So some might argue that it's your attitude for both learning and testing. Is that the key? Have you heard students say this before? I'm not good at taking tests. Or I have test anxiety, like it was a disease. Have you heard of this? Do you hear the level of confidence in that? It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? Imagine if this same attitude were applied to other performances like sports. Oh, I don't think I can hit the ball. I don't think I can run that far. I don't think I can jump that high. Or driving. How about this? I don't think I can drive on the interstate. I don't think I can take good tests. Do you hear this? So somehow what we got to do is get that attitude up there. All right, so finally, here's one way to do it. Make sure they have the skills. Some people think this is the most important factors for test success, the abilities needed to master a test. And these can be learned in practice, and that's what we do here at the Test Camp. We teach test skills fundamentals just like Marvis Collins teaches fundamentals. We do it the same way. So you know our philosophy. We have a 5-step problem-solving method called IDEAS. Everyone learns and practices the test skills, so there's no concern or anxiety. They stay focused, in the moment, and perform their best, of the best of their ability. That's all you can be asked to do. So there's been a case made for all 4 traits here in the last few minutes, the 4 A's: aptitude, achievement, attitude, and abilities or skills. Which do you think then is the most important? Yes, they're all important, but your task is to choose and defend only one there at your tables. Talk about it for a couple minutes. We'll come back as a group and share your thinking. Okay, again, if you're joining us live online, put your thoughts up here. And if you're watching the recording, we'll be here when you return. I'm back up here. Okay, so welcome back. We've heard some pretty good justification for all 4 of the A's. But it sounds like attitude may be the one was deemed most important. Is I got that? Do I have that right? The argument is that the proper attitude or effort, you can overcome shortcomings in any of the other 3. Aptitude, any subject that might not come quickly, add more time and effort. Achievement, you can gain any body of knowledge despite how difficult. Again, what's needed is time and effort. Abilities, the willingness to learn and practice the skills for success. All right, here's another A you might not have thought about. The ability to be able to adapt. This means a person can find success in any situation. They see themselves as a learner and focus on what they know are their preferences. They're honest with themselves about what they know and what they don't know. They see themselves as a student. They approach each student with a confident attitude, ready to apply their abilities and their skills. These are the folks that can believe they can accomplish anything. Have you heard this before? That you can accomplish anything? Do you believe it? Well, now you have the blueprint. Here's a couple of thoughts about how innovative leaders are thinking about testing. What is your definition of teaching and your definition of learning? Okay, what's the relationship? Can there be teaching if there's no learning? Or the other way around, if there was no learning, was there any teaching going on? This is the old if the tree falls in the woods question, right? Does it make a sound? So what's the implication when the standardized test scores are published? What's the perception of the public? When the student passes the test, who gets the credit? When the student fails the test, who gets the blame? Well, maybe it's not that simple. Instead, let's consider what some of the scores are saying about teaching and learning. Okay? If scores are going to be used for measuring accountability, consider that there are 4 main approaches to teaching and there's 4 main methods of learning. These can all be measured in pairs. The first is direct teaching. This is the method that's planned out, it's efficient, it's well-measured goals, and the learner is motivated by this argument. This is essential knowledge. You need to know this. You're going to need this in your adult life. In this pairing, both the teacher and the learner can easily be measured, the teaching and the learning. An administrator with a checklist can come by and make sure that the teacher follows the best practices. And as far as the learning is concerned, simply measure the knowledge and skills, how well they did on the test. The second pairing is quite different. It starts up there at the top. You see it says indirect teaching. This allows for a lot more free thinking for the student. Instead of telling, the teacher mostly is asking. The goals of learning might emerge from the learner, not from some prescribed set of standards. Because the curriculum is relevant to the learner down here at the bottom, they're naturally motivated that way. It's relevant to their lives. Have you been a student in this situation where you're asked to think or think for yourself? Let's go to the third pairing. Good teaching is sometimes measured by how well a teacher can form learners into groups. Teachers are rewarded for creating interdependence between learners, not independent, not dependent, but interdependence. These teachers believe that the students are motivated when the lesson is made interesting. A lot of this going on in schools today, isn't there? Projects are an example of hands-on learning. Students learning from other students. The opposite of group approach then would be individuals. Individual competence, which includes holding the student responsible for their own learning. And the learner is motivated when the curriculum is determined to be worthwhile. They have to buy into this. This is worthwhile. So the learner would have to buy into that notion that what we're learning is important. It's worth their time and their effort. So there's the criteria for evaluating both teaching and for learning. Now, do you have a preference? Have you long enough in your studies or in your experience to know that you have a certain teaching style or a certain learning style? And is your preference the same for both teaching and learning? Does that match up? Talk about it and compare this there for a couple of minutes there at the tables, and we'll come back in just a moment as a group. By the way, there is no particular right way. Those of you joining us live online, please continue. You've been very helpful. We take your suggestions up here and we include them in our discussions. If you're watching a recording, good time to pause, think some of this over, and we'll be here when you return. Okay, so we heard quite an array of preferences during the discussion. One interesting point is that since schooling has shifted in the direction of direct teaching with an emphasis on group learning, and this might have implications for testing. Everyone doesn't get a ribbon just for showing up on test day like they might in some classrooms. Learners have to, many for the first time, perform individually in a quiet atmosphere on a standardized test. They have to take individual responsibility. Or do they? What's the reaction of the students when they fail? Does the locus of control stay the same? You know that term, locus of control? Did they look to themselves and say, oh, I could have worked harder? Or did they look to the others and place blame? How about the parents and the school administrators or the teachers? When standardized test scores are published, what's the view of the public? Which is being tested? Okay, some of you say it's the teaching that's being tested. Some say the learning. Well, while some school districts are beginning to hold teachers more accountable for standardized test scores, high-stakes consequences still fall right there on the learner. Test scores are used to decide their destiny in the system. What are some of the consequences? Ability groups. How many of you here today have been put in an ability group in your school career? Every one of you, it looks like. Yeah, every hand is up. It's very rare to find schools that don't use test scores to decide student placement. How about this? Tracking. How many of you here today because you were tracked? You don't know what that is. Not as many hands. What is tracking? Anybody can explain it? I'll repeat for the folks listening in. Yes, correct. Not only were you put into ability groups into certain classes, you were also put on pathways of classes, certain classes that only your group could take based on your test scores. Okay, so now how many of you were tracked? Yeah, pretty much everyone. How about test scores used for promotion? Are standardized test scores used as a factor in moving students through the system? Sure they are. That's why it's called high stakes testing. If we had the time today, now that you thought about it, wouldn't it be interesting to discuss which of these practices as the most high stakes, being grouped, being tracked, or being promoted. So it's learning being tested, not the teacher. What is being tested? What is on the test? We said earlier that there are four main considerations for learning. The first is top down, from the adult in charge. The students need a certain body of knowledge. They need essentials. They have to be productive adults someday. The opposite approach is to engage in the learner in the curriculum and activities that the students think is relevant. Learners might be engaged more with lessons that enable group work that's interesting. Or learning happens best when the curriculum is viewed by the teacher and the student to be worthwhile. Now, which of these is not considered on a standardized test? What do you think? Yes, relevant. A standardized test does not take into consideration what some individual teacher thinks is relevant for their students, or what a learner thinks is relevant for their life. What else can you eliminate? Interesting. Does a standardized test have a concern for what the teacher makes interesting in the class, or what the learner finds interesting during school? One more. Of the two left, which is the least likely to be on a standardized test? What is worthwhile? A standardized test cannot be designed to match what is worthwhile for the teacher or the student. So if you are a good employee of the government, of the public company, the public school, your teaching is going to be aligned with what? What is essential, according to the experts hired to create the government test, to create the curriculum guide and the matching standardized test. Now, you might remember earlier that the argument that both teaching and learning have been narrowed by too much testing. Now you see their reasoning. So, essential knowledge determined by experts is what teachers and learners are facing on standardized tests. If you're a teacher with a preference for humanism and you're planning to allow students to explore their interest and follow their passion, how do you plan to prepare students in your charge for their high-stakes government tests, especially if this approach doesn't match your vision of teaching or learning? All right? Did you join us in the Pathways to Teaching workshop? How long are you going to last in this profession if it doesn't take into account your professional philosophy? Let's be fair and look at some of the other side of the moment. All right, as a professional educators, we are decision makers, so we need a research tool to provide data to help us make important decisions. We need valid and reliable information to make data-driven decisions. Decisions like where to place the learners in certain programs, where to place the learners in terms of their school or their grade levels, or with which teachers. Decisions like who qualifies to be certified for a diploma, for a diploma, and in a case like yours, to be certified for membership in the teaching profession. This is starting to look familiar, isn't it? Like what's going on in schools. The argument is that testing then is a performance. It's a challenge, and a lot can be learned from watching how teachers and learners prepare for the challenge of testing. Do they make the challenge an opportunity to grow, or blame the system or each other for failure? Information from testing can be gathered before or during or after a certain treatment in the school. And these are the common terms that are associated with when an assessment might be administered. Now, you'll want to be familiar with these terms before taking your certification test if you haven't already. Other terms related to testing are used when working in a government program. These terms help decision makers talk with each other and determine competency of each candidate. All right, and then again, competency can be thought of in the terms of knowledge, skills, and dispositions, or the attitudes. And as we've discussed, it's knowledge that's most often being tested. So think about it. On your certification test, which are standardized, it's mainly your knowledge that's being tested. Skills and dispositions are assessed, tested during your internship and apprenticeship on the job. not on the test. All right, so that's been our look at some of the reasons why testing has been used so much in this country. It's a phenomenon. We looked also at what challenges this poses for the stakeholders, the parents, the students, the educational leaders, and for you. We also looked at how some of the stakeholders are approaching these challenges. Hope that was helpful to you. So on behalf of all those who helped bring you this workshop, we thank you for joining us. We hope to see you again here at the Test Camp.